Today, we're diving into an incredible story, one that has stood the test of time and continues to inspire millions around the world. It's the story of George Müller, a man whose life is a true testimony to the power of God and his divine provision. If you've ever wondered whether God really hears prayers or if he truly provides in miraculous ways, then George Müller's life is a story you need to hear. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified about future videos. Müller's faith journey is not just another historical account. It's a living example of how God can use anyone, no matter their circumstances, to accomplish extraordinary things. His story is all about faith, prayer, and an unshakable trust in God's provision. So if you're someone who's been waiting on God to show up in a big way, stick around, because this story might just renew your hope and strengthen your faith. Without further ado, let's get into the remarkable story of George Müller and how his life is a powerful reflection of God's provision. Let's start at the beginning. George Müller was born in Prussia, which is modern-day Germany, in 1805. Now here's the interesting part. He didn't grow up as a man of faith. In fact, he was quite the opposite. As a young man, Müller was known for his rebellious and sinful behavior. He lied, cheated, and even stole from his own father. He lived a reckless life, partying and indulging in the things of the world. But isn't that just like God? He often takes the most unlikely people and transforms them for his purposes. And that's exactly what happened to George Müller. While studying at university, Müller had a radical conversion. One evening, a friend invited him to a small Christian prayer meeting. It was there that Müller's heart was transformed by the power of the gospel. He realized the depth of his sin, but more importantly, he encountered the grace and forgiveness of God. From that moment on, his life took a dramatic turn. Müller's conversion after giving his life to Christ, Müller felt a deep calling to serve the Lord. He eventually moved to England, where he began his ministry. But it wasn't just any ministry. Müller had a burning desire to help the poor, the orphaned, and the forgotten, people who, in his time, were often neglected by society. But Müller didn't just want to help. He wanted to live out his faith in a radical way. He felt convicted by one core principle, total dependence on God for provision. He believed that God alone would provide for all of his needs, and he wanted to show the world what it looked like to trust God completely, without asking people for money, without making appeals for help, and without relying on human support. He wanted to prove that God hears and answers prayers. And so, George Müller embarked on what would become one of the most extraordinary faith journeys of the 19th century. The orphanages, a miracle of provision. Now here's where the story gets truly remarkable. George Müller is best known for establishing orphanages in Bristol, England. At the time, the plight of orphans was dire. Children who had lost their parents were often left to fend for themselves, living on the streets or in dangerous workhouses. Müller's heart broke for these children, and he knew he had to do something. In 1836, Müller and his wife Mary opened their first orphanage. But here's the thing, they had no money, zero. And yet they believed that God would provide for every single need, food, clothing, housing, everything. Müller made a commitment that he would never ask anyone for financial support. Instead, he would rely entirely on prayer, trusting that God would stir the hearts of people to give. And guess what? God did, time and time again. One of the most famous aspects of Müller's ministry was how often he and the orphans would sit down for meals with no food in the house. Imagine that for a moment. Dozens of hungry children sitting at the table ready to eat, but no food in sight. And yet, Müller would lead them in prayer, thanking God for the meal they were about to receive. And then, just in time, there would be a knock at the door. A baker would show up with extra bread, or a milkman's cart would break down right outside the orphanage, and he'd offer the milk before it spoiled. Time and time again, God provided exactly what was needed, often at the very last moment. It wasn't just coincidence, it was divine provision. A life of prayer. One of the key lessons from George Müller's life is the power of prayer. Müller didn't just pray when times were tough. He made prayer a daily, ongoing conversation with God. He kept detailed journals where he recorded thousands of answers to prayer. In fact, by the end of his life, Müller had documented over 50,000 specific answers to prayer. 50,000! That's more than one answered prayer every single day for his entire adult life. But here's the thing, Müller didn't see prayer as a way to get things from God. Instead, he viewed prayer as an opportunity to align his will with God's will. He trusted that God knew what was best, and he was content whether the answer was yes, no, or wait. Müller's faith was so strong that even when he faced obstacles, he didn't waver. When the orphanage grew and they needed larger buildings to accommodate more children, Müller prayed. And when funds seemed insufficient, Müller prayed. When sickness spread through the orphanage, Müller prayed. And every single time, God showed up. One of the most remarkable things about George Müller is that he never took a salary. Instead, he lived entirely by faith, trusting God to provide for his personal needs as well. And provide God did. Müller lived a life that proved, over and over again, that when you seek first the kingdom of God, all other things will be added unto you. Building faith in others. Another beautiful part of Müller's story is that his life of faith inspired countless others. People from all over the world heard about what was happening in Bristol, and they were amazed by how God was working through this one man's prayers. His story spread far beyond the walls of the orphanages, encouraging Christians everywhere to trust God more fully. Müller's example of living by faith wasn't just for his own benefit. It was a testimony to the world. He wanted people to know that God is faithful, that he hears our prayers, and that he delights in providing for his children. And it wasn't just financial provision, it was spiritual provision, emotional provision, and relational provision. George Müller's life was a living, breathing example of God's promise to never leave or forsake his people. Even after the age of 70, Müller didn't slow down. He spent the final 17 years of his life traveling the world, preaching the gospel and sharing his story. He visited over 40 countries, preaching to thousands of people and encouraging them to place their trust in God. Müller's story continues to inspire generations even long after his death in 1898. What we can learn from George Müller. So, what can we take away from the life of George Müller? First and foremost, his story is a powerful reminder that God provides. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the needs in our lives, whether it's financial struggles, health issues, or relationships that need healing. But George Müller's life shows us that when we put our trust in God and seek him in prayer, he is faithful to provide in ways we can't even imagine. Secondly, Müller's story teaches us that faith isn't passive. It's not just sitting back and hoping for the best. It's an active, daily trust in God even when we can't see the way forward. Müller didn't sit back and wait for things to happen. He stepped out in faith, trusting that God would meet him in the midst of his needs. And God did over and over again. Finally, Müller's life is a testimony to the power of prayer. Prayer isn't just a ritual. It's a conversation with the Creator of the universe. And through prayer, we're able to align our hearts with God's will. As George Müller discovered, prayer isn't about bending God to our desires. It's about trusting that his plan is better than anything we could ever imagine. In conclusion, George Müller's story is one of faith, provision, and the power of prayer. It's a story that shows us what's possible when we fully trust in God's promises. Whether you're facing challenges in your own life or simply seeking to grow in your faith, Müller's life is a reminder that God sees us, he hears us, and he provides in ways that are beyond what we could ever hope for. I hope this story has encouraged you as much as it has encouraged me. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more faith-inspiring content. And let me know in the comments, what's an area of your life where you're trusting God for provision? I'd love to hear your story.
Please subscribe to my channel if you have not done it yet, and don't forget to click the notification button. I hope you guys learned and enjoyed this video. Thank you, and have a great day.